Marcus Chen had always been different from the other soldiers in his unit. While they cleaned their rifles with the same care most people reserved for their cars, Marcus focused on his medical bag. His fingers knew every bandage, every morphine, syringe, every piece of equipment that could mean the difference between life and death for his brothers in arms. The other guys called him Doc, with genuine respect, even though he was just 22 and had never been to medical school. In the Army, the medic earned that title through training and trust, not degrees. Marcus had both in spades, but what he didn't have was a single confirmed kill. Not one enemy soldier had fallen to his weapon, and honestly, that suited him just fine. Growing up in a small town in Oregon, Marcus had always been the kid who caught spiders in cups to release them outside rather than stepping on them. His mother used to joke that he'd probably become a veterinarian because he couldn't stand to see anything suffer. The Army recruiter had seen something different in the quiet young man who volunteered for medical training without hesitation. Some soldiers are born to fight, Sergeant Rodriguez had told him during basic training. Others are born to heal. Both are warriors, just different kinds. Marcus carried those words with him through every mission. While his squad mates returned fire and advanced on enemy positions, he moved through the chaos with a different purpose. His job was to keep people alive, to drag wounded soldiers to safety, to work miracles with limited supplies under the worst possible conditions. The squad had been deployed to Afghanistan for 8 months now, and Marcus had saved 17 lives. Everyone knew the count because they kept track. 17 soldiers who went home to their families because Doc Chen had the steady hands and quick thinking to patch them up when bullets and shrapnel tried to write a different ending to their stories. But Marcus had never pulled his trigger in anger. His rifle stayed slung across his back most of the time, overshadowed by the much more familiar weight of his medical bag. The closest he'd come to combat was providing covering fire while evacuating wounded, and even then he'd aimed high, hoping to suppress rather than eliminate. The guys never gave him grief about it. They understood that their medic had different priorities, different training, different instincts. When incoming fire forced everyone to take cover, Marcus was usually the first one moving again, crawling toward whoever was screaming for help. While others calculated angles and distances for their shots, Marcus calculated blood loss and treatment options. Staff Sergeant Williams ran a tight squad, and he appreciated having a medic who thought like a medic rather than trying to be another infantry soldier. Doc's job is to bring you home alive, he'd tell new replacements. Your job is to make sure nobody needs bringing home in the first place. The arrangement worked well for everyone involved. Marcus felt comfortable in his role as the squad's guardian angel, the one who fixed what combat broke. His rifle was there if he needed it, cleaned and maintained like everyone else's, but it remained more of a security blanket than a primary tool. That dynamic had served them well through dozens of patrols, several firefights, and more close calls than anyone wanted to count. Marcus had earned his reputation as someone who could work miracles under pressure, who could keep talking to wounded soldiers to keep them conscious, who somehow always had exactly what he needed in that medical bag. Nobody expected that reputation was about to change dramatically. Nobody, including Marcus himself, had any idea that circumstances were about to put him in a position where his healing hands would have to make a very different kind of life or death decision. The morning of the incident started like any other patrol day. Marcus checked his medical supplies twice, made sure his radio worked, and grabbed an extra canteen because the Afghan heat was unforgiving. He exchanged the usual pre-mission jokes with his squad mates, everyone dealing with nerves in their own way. As they loaded into the Humvee, Private Johnson asked Marcus about his girlfriend back home, something that had become a kind of ritual before dangerous missions. Marcus would talk about Sarah, about their plans for when he got home, about the normal life waiting for him beyond the war. It helped everyone remember what they were fighting for. The patrol route would take them through several villages where intelligence suggested insurgent activity. Their job was to gather information, show presence, and hopefully avoid any major confrontations. It was supposed to be routine, the kind of mission they'd completed successfully many times before. Marcus settled into his usual spot in the vehicle, medical bag at his feet, rifle properly secured, mind already going through mental checklists of emergency procedures he hoped he wouldn't need. The road ahead looked peaceful enough in the early morning light, but Afghanistan had taught all of them that appearances could be deadly deceiving. None of them knew they were driving toward a situation that would test every assumption Marcus had about himself, about his role, and about what it really meant to be a soldier whose primary mission was saving lives. The convoy had been moving for 2 hours when they reached the checkpoint outside Kandahar province. What should have been a routine stop became the first sign that this day would be different from all the others. Local villagers were gone. The usual kids who ran alongside American vehicles hoping for candy or bottled water were nowhere to be seen, and even the dogs seemed to have disappeared. Staff Sergeant Williams noticed it first. 23 years in the Army had taught him to read the invisible signs that separated safe days from dangerous ones. "Something's not right here," he muttered into his radio, ordering the convoy to halt while he assessed the situation. Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his stomach that came with heightened alert status. He ran through his mental checklist automatically, confirming that he knew exactly where every piece of medical equipment was located. His hands found the radio clipped to his vest, making sure he could call for medevac helicopters without looking, away from whatever emergency might develop. The village elder who usually met them at this checkpoint was missing. Instead, a nervous young man approached their lead vehicle, speaking rapidly in broken English about Taliban fighters moving through the area overnight. His eyes kept darting toward the hills surrounding the valley, and his hands shook as he gestured. "They came with many weapons," the young man explained. "They said Americans would die today. They said anyone who helps Americans would die too." Williams made the decision to push forward rather than turn back. Intelligence had indicated that a high-value target might be in the next village, someone worth the risk of continuing the mission despite the obvious warning signs. The convoy would proceed, but with everyone at maximum alertness. Marcus checked his weapon for the first time that morning, making sure a round was chambered and his safety was off. It felt strange in his hands, heavier somehow than usual. He'd qualified expert marksman in training, but that felt like a lifetime ago. His hands were more accustomed to starting IV lines and applying pressure bandages than gripping rifle stocks and finding target acquisition. The road ahead wound through a narrow valley with steep hills on both sides, perfect terrain for an ambush. Every soldier in the convoy knew it, but they also knew their job. They drove forward slowly, scanning the hillsides through rifle scopes and vehicle-mounted weapons, looking for any sign of movement that might indicate enemy positions. Private Rodriguez was manning the radio, maintaining contact with base and updating their position every few minutes. The crackling voices from headquarters seemed reassuringly normal, a connection to the world beyond this increasingly tense valley, where shadows moved wrong and silence felt threatening. Marcus found himself thinking about Sarah's last letter, about her description of spring arriving in Oregon, about things that seemed impossibly far away from the dust and danger surrounding him now. He used those thoughts to keep his breathing steady, to maintain the calm focus that had served him well in every previous emergency situation. The first shot came without warning, a sharp crack that echoed off the valley walls and sent everyone diving for whatever cover they could find. Marcus heard the distinctive whine of a bullet passing close overhead and felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with contact. His medical training kicked in automatically, assessing threats and planning treatment options for casualties that hadn't happened yet, but probably would. "Contact left," Williams shouted into his radio, and suddenly the quiet morning exploded into the chaos of a firefight. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions on the hillsides, and the American vehicles responded immediately with overwhelming firepower designed to suppress the enemy attack. Marcus stayed low, but kept moving, positioning himself where he could reach wounded soldiers quickly when the inevitable call for medic came. He could see muzzle flashes winking from concealed positions among the rocks and scrub brush, could hear bullets striking metal and kicking up dust all around their position. The engagement intensified quickly, with both sides pouring fire across the valley in a deadly exchange that would determine who controlled this piece of ground. Marcus knew from experience that the initial fury would give way to more tactical maneuvering. that someone would eventually gain advantage through superior position or firepower, or simple luck. What he didn't know was that circumstances were already in motion that would force him into a situation no amount of medical training had prepared him for. The enemy had planned this ambush carefully, and part of their strategy involved neutralizing the American medic who had saved too many lives they'd tried to take. A sniper somewhere in the hills had been given specific instructions about the soldier with the red cross on his helmet, the one who always moved toward wounded Americans instead of away from them. That sniper was already tracking Marcus through his scope, waiting for the perfect moment to eliminate the man who represented hope and survival to everyone around him. The battle was about to become very personal for the medic who had never fired his weapon in anger. The call Marcus had been dreading came 15 minutes into the firefight. "Medic! Medic!" The voice belonged to Private Johnson, and it carried the particular note of panic that meant someone was hurt badly. Marcus didn't hesitate, grabbing his medical bag and moving toward the sound despite bullets snapping through the air around him. He found Johnson crouched behind a boulder, applying pressure to a wound on Corporal Davis's leg. The injury looked bad but manageable, the kind of thing Marcus had treated successfully many times before. Davis was conscious and alert, cursing creatively about his luck but showing no signs of shock or life-threatening blood loss. "I can walk," Davis insisted through gritted teeth, though his leg suggested otherwise. Marcus ignored him and began working, cutting away fabric to get a clear look at the wound. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels, painful but not permanently damaging if treated properly. Marcus worked efficiently, cleaning and bandaging the wound while staying low to avoid the continuing gunfire. His hands moved with practiced precision, muscle memory taking over while his mind calculated treatment options and evacuation possibilities. This was what he'd trained for, what he was good at, what made sense in a world that often didn't. "You're going to be fine," he told Davis, and meant it. "Hurts like hell, but you'll be dancing at your wedding next month just like planned." Davis managed a weak grin. Sarah's going to love having a husband with a war wound to show off. Marcus had just finished securing the bandage when he heard the sound that changed everything. A high-pitched whistle followed by an explosion that shook the ground beneath them. Incoming mortar fire meant the enemy was escalating, bringing heavier weapons into play. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, but worse than the mortars was what Marcus saw when he raised his head to assess the new threat. Private Thompson was down in the open, 30 yards away from any cover, clutching his chest and calling weakly for help. He'd been hit while trying to reach a better fighting position, and now lay exposed in what amounted to a kill zone. Marcus evaluated the situation instantly. Thompson was wounded, possibly dying, and completely vulnerable to enemy fire. Getting to him would require crossing open ground under direct observation from multiple enemy positions. It was exactly the kind of rescue that Marcus had performed successfully before, but never under such concentrated enemy fire. "Don't even think about it, Doc," Johnson said, reading Marcus's expression. "It's suicide. Thompson's probably already gone." But Marcus could see Thompson moving, could hear him calling for help, could see the expanding stain on his uniform that meant he was bleeding out. Every instinct Marcus possessed demanded that he move toward that wounded soldier, regardless of personal risk. That's what medics did. That's who he was. Marcus began moving toward Thompson before he'd fully decided to do it, staying as low as possible while covering ground quickly. Bullets immediately began tracking his movement, enemy fighters recognizing the medic's distinctive gear and understanding the tactical advantage of eliminating him. He made it 20 yards before the sniper found him. The bullet struck the ground inches from his head, close enough that he felt the impact through the earth beneath him. A second shot followed immediately, this one close enough to his left shoulder that he felt the bullet's passage disturb the air around him. Marcus dove behind a fallen log that provided minimal cover and realized he was pinned down. The sniper had him bracketed, knew exactly where he was, and could prevent him from reaching Thompson or returning to his squad. Worse, Thompson's calls for help were getting weaker, which meant time was running out. From his position behind the log, Marcus could see the muzzle flash from the sniper's position, a rocky outcrop about 200 yards up the hillside. The Shooter was well concealed and had an excellent field of fire covering the entire area where Thompson lay wounded. Marcus had two choices: stay put and let Thompson die, or find a way to neutralize the sniper who was preventing the rescue. For the first time in his military career, staying safe and letting someone else handle the fighting wasn't an option. No one else was positioned to help Thompson, and no one else could provide the medical care the wounded soldier desperately needed. Marcus checked his rifle, making sure it was ready to fire. His hands felt different on the weapon now, steadier somehow, focused by necessity and desperation. He'd qualified as an expert marksman in training, but this would be different. This would be real, with consequences that extended far beyond. Target scores and training evaluations. Thompson's voice was barely audible now, a whispered plea for help that cut through Marcus like a blade. The medic, who had never fired his weapon in anger, found himself in a position where shooting to kill might be the only way to save a life. The sniper was waiting, patient and professional, knowing that eventually the American medic would have to expose himself to reach the wounded soldier. It was a deadly game of chess played with bullets and blood, and Marcus realized he was about to make a move that would change him forever. Marcus forced himself to think like a soldier instead of a medic for the first time in his military career. He studied the sniper's position through his rifle scope, calculating distance, wind conditions, and angles of approach. 200 yards wasn't an impossible shot, but it wasn't easy either, especially under combat stress with a wounded soldier's life hanging in the balance. The enemy shooter had chosen his position well, nestled among rocks that provided excellent concealment, while offering clear views of the entire valley floor. Marcus could see just enough of the sniper's rifle barrel to confirm the location, but getting a clear shot at the shooter himself would require patience and precise timing. Marcus controlled his breathing the way his marksmanship instructors had taught him, finding the natural pause between heartbeats where his body was most stable. He'd done this hundreds of times on training ranges, but those targets hadn't been shooting back. Those targets hadn't been preventing him from saving lives. Thompson's voice had stopped calling for help, which meant either he'd lost consciousness or something worse. Marcus felt urgency building in his chest, the desperate need to move, to act, to do something before it was too late. But rushing would guarantee failure, and failure would mean Thompson died along with any other soldier who tried to rescue him. The sniper fired again, the bullet striking close enough to Marcus's position to shower him with dirt and rock fragments. The shot revealed the enemy's exact location for a split second, giving Marcus the clear view he needed to line up his own shot. He could see part of the sniper's head and shoulder now, enough of a target to work with if he could remain steady and accurate. Marcus had to make a choice that went against everything he'd trained for, everything he believed about his role as a healer. He had to decide to take a life in order to save one. The internal conflict lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity of moral struggle compressed into heartbeats. He thought about Thompson bleeding out in the open, about the soldier's young wife who was expecting their first child, about all the lives Marcus had saved and all the lives he might still save if he could reach that wounded man. The decision crystallized with sudden clarity. Sometimes saving lives required taking them. Marcus steadied his rifle against the fallen log, finding the most stable shooting position possible under the circumstances. He aligned his scope's crosshairs on the barely visible target, adjusting for distance and the slight breeze moving across the valley. His finger found the trigger and applied the first stage of pressure, preparing for the shot that would change everything. The sniper moved slightly, perhaps adjusting his own aim for another shot at the pinned American medic. The movement gave Marcus a clearer view of his target, enough of the enemy soldier visible to ensure an accurate shot. Marcus held his breath, found that perfect moment of stillness between heartbeats, and squeezed the trigger with steady pressure. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that seemed impossibly loud after the careful silence of preparation. Through his scope, Marcus saw the impact, saw the enemy sniper jerk backward and disappear behind the rocks. The hillside position went suddenly quiet. No more muzzle flashes, no more incoming fire from that location. Marcus didn't have time to process what he'd just done. Thompson needed immediate medical attention, and now the path to reach him was clear. Marcus grabbed his medical bag and sprinted across the open ground, covering the distance in seconds while staying as low as possible. Thompson was unconscious, but alive, breathing shallow and rapid with the distinctive signs of shock setting. Marcus began working immediately, cutting away the soldier's gear to access the chest wound. The bullet had entered high on the right side, missing the heart, but possibly nicking a lung. Marcus worked with focused intensity, applying pressure, to control bleeding while preparing the equipment he'd need for a more complex field treatment. Thompson's pulse was weak but steady, his breathing labored but adequate. The wound was serious but treatable if Marcus could stabilize him quickly enough for evacuation. "Stay with me, Thompson," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure the wounded soldier could hear him. "Your baby needs to meet Daddy when you get home." As Marcus worked, he remained intensely aware of the hillside where the sniper had been positioned. Part of his mind wondered if the enemy soldier was dead, wounded, or simply taking cover. Part of him hoped the shot had been enough to neutralize the threat without necessarily killing, though he knew the reality was probably different. The medical work demanded all his attention, but Marcus couldn't completely suppress the knowledge that he'd crossed a line he'd never expected to cross. He'd fired his weapon with lethal intent, had aimed to kill another human being. The fact that it was necessary, that it had saved Thompson's life, didn't make it feel any less momentous. Marcus got an IV line started and radioed for immediate medevac evacuation, while continuing to monitor Thompson's vital signs. The wounded soldier was stable but critical, alive because his medic had been willing to become something he'd never wanted to be. The firefight continued around them, but Marcus had created a small bubble of medical sanctuary in the middle of chaos, doing what he did best while trying not to think about what he'd had to do to make it possible. The medevac helicopter arrived within 20 minutes, guided by smoke grenades and radio coordinates that Marcus provided while continuing to treat Thompson. The wounded soldier had regained consciousness briefly, long enough to squeeze Marcus's hand and whisper thank you before drifting back into medical sedation. Marcus helped load Thompson into the helicopter, providing the flight medic with detailed information about treatment administered and current condition. As the helicopter lifted off carrying his patient toward the field hospital, Marcus felt the familiar satisfaction of a successful rescue mixed with something entirely new and unwelcome. The firefight was winding down, enemy resistance fading, as American firepower and tactical superiority asserted control over the battlefield. Staff Sergeant Williams had called in artillery support that convinced the remaining insurgents to withdraw rather than face complete annihilation. The valley fell quiet except for radio chatter and the sound of soldiers checking their equipment. Marcus walked back toward his squad's position, medical bag slung over his shoulder, rifle in his hands feeling heavier than it had that morning. Several soldiers nodded as he passed, the kind of acknowledgement warriors gave each other after successful combat. But Marcus didn't feel like a warrior. He felt like a medic who had been forced to become something else, something he wasn't sure he understood yet. "Hell of a shot, Doc," Private Johnson said when Marcus reached their position. "Saw the whole thing through my scope. 200 yards, moving target, under fire. That was professional-grade marksmanship." Marcus nodded but didn't respond. He busied himself checking his medical supplies, restocking items used in treating. Thompson and Davis maintaining the routine that helped him process stress and trauma. His hands moved automatically through familiar tasks while his mind struggled with unfamiliar territory. Staff Sergeant Williams approached with the careful expression he wore when dealing with soldiers who'd experienced their first kill. It was a conversation he'd had many times before, though never with a medic who'd been forced into combat by medical necessity rather than tactical requirement. "You did what you had to do, Marcus," Williams said, using his first name instead of the usual Doc designation. "Thompson's alive because you made a hard choice under impossible circumstances. That's what soldiers do." Marcus looked up from his medical bag. "I became a medic to save lives, not take them. I never wanted to kill anyone." Williams sat down beside him, understanding that this was a defining moment for the young medic. "You didn't kill anyone today. You saved Thompson. Everything else was just the price of doing that job." The philosophical distinction felt important, somehow, though Marcus wasn't sure he entirely believed it yet. He'd aimed his rifle at another human being and pulled the trigger with lethal intent, Whatever his motivations, whatever the circumstances, that action had consequences he was only beginning to understand. The squad spent another hour in the valley, collecting intelligence and ensuring no enemy forces remained in the area. Marcus treated minor injuries, checked on Davis's condition, and maintained radio contact with the medevac team, updating him on Thompson's status. The routine medical work helped ground him, reminded him of his primary identity and purpose. But something had changed fundamentally in how others looked at him. The soldiers who had always respected his medical skills now regarded him with the additional recognition reserved for proven combat veterans. Marcus had crossed into territory that most medics never entered, demonstrating that healing hands could also deliver lethal precision when circumstances demanded it. The confirmation came through radio traffic that Marcus pretended not to hear. Reconnaissance teams had found the sniper's position and confirmed one enemy KIA, killed by a single rifle shot at approximately 200 yards. The enemy soldier had been armed with a Russian-made sniper rifle equipped with a high-powered scope, exactly the kind of weapon that could have picked off American soldiers throughout the valley. Marcus felt no satisfaction at the confirmation, no pride in marksmanship or tactical success. He felt only the weight of having taken a life, regardless of the justification or necessity. It was a burden he'd never expected to carry, one that his medical training hadn't prepared him to process. The convoy began moving again, heading back toward base with mission objectives completed and all personnel accounted for. Marcus rode in the same position he'd occupied that morning, medical bag at his feet, rifle properly secured. But everything felt different now, viewed through the lens of experience that had changed his fundamental understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. During the ride, Marcus thought about Thompson's wife, about the child who would grow up with a father because difficult choices had been made under impossible circumstances. He thought about the enemy soldier's family, people who would mourn their loss and might never understand the context that made it necessary. The moral complexity wasn't something that could be resolved with simple answers or absolute principles. Marcus realized he'd entered the gray area, where good people sometimes had to do terrible things for reasons that made sense only in the moment, only under the specific pressures that defined life and death decisions in combat. As the base came into view, Marcus knew he'd return to his primary role as healer and caregiver, but he'd never again be just a medic. He'd become something more complicated, something that encompassed both the desire to preserve life and the willingness to end it when preservation required elimination of threat. 3 weeks later, Marcus received a letter from Thompson's wife, Sarah, thanking him for saving her husband's life. She included a photograph of Thompson holding their newborn daughter, both of them healthy and smiling in a hospital room back in Texas. The baby's name was Hope, and Thompson had insisted on naming Marcus as her godfather. Marcus stared at the photograph for a long time, seeing the future that existed because he'd made an impossible choice under desperate circumstances. Thompson was walking again, fully recovered from his chest wound, scheduled for discharge and return to civilian life. The sniper's bullet that should have ended everything had instead become just another scar with a story behind it. The recognition came through official channels as well. Staff Sergeant Williams had recommended Marcus for a Bronze Star with Valor, citing exceptional courage under fire and actions that directly saved an American soldier's life. The paperwork described the incident in clinical military language that somehow missed the emotional complexity of what had actually happened. Marcus wasn't sure he wanted the medal. Awards were meant for heroes, and he still struggled with feeling heroic about taking a life, even under the circumstances that had made it necessary. The commendation represented recognition for combat effectiveness rather than medical skill, acknowledging a part of himself he'd never wanted to develop, but his squad mates saw it differently. They'd started calling him Combat Doc, a title that carried respect for both his medical abilities and his proven effectiveness under fire. Marcus had become something unique in their experience, a medic who could fight when fighting became necessary to save lives. The dynamic had changed subtly but permanently. Other soldiers still came to Marcus for medical treatment and advice, but they also sought his counsel on combat situations where medical considerations intersected with tactical decisions. His perspective as someone who understood both healing and harm gave him insights that pure infantry soldiers sometimes lacked. Marcus found himself thinking more strategically about battlefield medicine, considering not just how to treat wounds, but how to prevent them through better tactical positioning and threat elimination. His medical bag remained his primary tool, but his rifle had become something more than emergency backup equipment. The internal conflict persisted, though it evolved into something more manageable over time. Marcus began to understand that moral complexity wasn't a problem to be solved, but a reality to be navigated. Good people in impossible situations sometimes had to make choices that defied easy categorization as right or wrong. He wrote letters to Thompson regularly, following the family's progress and sharing details about deployment life that couldn't go into official communications. Thompson had returned to his job as a high school teacher, telling his students stories about courage and sacrifice that included lessons about the medic who'd saved his life. Marcus also began mentoring younger medics who joined the unit, teaching them not just medical procedures, but the broader responsibilities that came with being the person everyone counted on to preserve life under the worst possible circumstances. Some of those conversations included discussions about situations where medical duties might require combat actions. "Your job is to save lives," Marcus would tell new medics, echoing the words Staff Sergeant Williams had once shared with him. Sometimes that means treating wounds. Sometimes it means preventing them from happening in the first place. Both require courage, both require skill, and both are necessary. The deployment ended 6 months later with Marcus having saved 31 lives and taken one. The mathematical imbalance seemed significant somehow, a net positive that helped justify the moral complexity he'd learned to carry. He'd become someone capable of both extreme gentleness and decisive violence, depending on what circumstances required for the preservation of life. Returning home to Oregon, Marcus found it difficult to explain his experiences to people who hadn't shared them. Sarah, his girlfriend who'd waited faithfully through the deployment, understood that he'd changed without needing detailed explanations. She could see the additional depth in his eyes, the weight of experiences that had shaped him in ways that went beyond simple military service. Marcus eventually became a physician's assistant, using GI Bill benefits to formalize the medical knowledge he'd gained through military training and practical experience. But he never forgot the lesson learned in that Afghan valley. The understanding that healing sometimes required harm, that saving lives occasionally demanded taking them. Years later, working in a civilian emergency room, Marcus would sometimes encounter situations that required the same kind of split-second decision-making that had defined his combat experience. The stakes were usually lower, the choices less dramatic, but the underlying principle remained constant. Good people sometimes had to do difficult things for reasons that made sense only in the moment. The photograph of Thompson and his daughter, Hope, remained on Marcus's desk throughout his medical career, a reminder of the day when being a medic meant becoming something more complicated, something that encompassed both the capacity for unlimited compassion and the willingness to exercise necessary violence when compassion alone wasn't enough to save lives. Marcus never regretted the choice he'd made that day, though he never stopped feeling the weight of its consequences. He'd learned that being truly dedicated to preserving life sometimes meant being equally committed to ending threats against it, and that lesson had made him both a better medic and a more complete human being.